All right, so here we go. The very last unit of American History 2. You finally made it. So hopefully this unit is an easy one. A lot of it will feel like current events to you. The parts that don't will still feel very recent. So a lot of it you may have lived through, or your parents lived through and you've heard plenty about it because it's really was not long ago at all. So because of that, it should be pretty easy to get a handle on the majority of this information. That being said, there is a lot here that we're going to be covering in not a lot of time. So if I'm talking fast, that's why. So we're starting with the election of 1992. Now, I already talked about George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency in the last unit when we were talking about post-Cold War foreign policy. So now we've come to the end of his term, his only term as president, and we're seeing here the election of Bill Clinton. So George Bush was running for re-election, and he had a serious lead in the polls for quite some time. He had a lot of support after his win in the Persian Gulf War. Bill Clinton, on the other side, was a Democratic nominee. He had been the governor of Arkansas for quite a few years. He was raised largely by his mother and his grandparents, so they really pushed education and the importance of education a lot when he was growing up. So because of that, that was something that had always been a big piece of his platform, which people really appreciated. So after a few months into the campaign, Clinton started to get a big lead in the public opinion polls. The LA riots had broken out after the Rodney King verdict, and they were putting a lot of pressure on President Bush. Bush was also beginning to experience some problems with the economy. Now, after the Cold War, that ended up being a positive for the Democrats. You know, the Republicans had, for a long time, been able to say that they were hard against communism, and that wasn't really something the Democrats could say. But now that that's not an issue anymore, people don't have to worry about the Democrats standing up to the Soviets. So overall, a point comes where most people were just unhappy with both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and it just became a lesser of two evils situation. Now, the final nail in Bush's coffin is going to be a man named Ross Perot, P-E-R-O-T. Ross Perot ran as an independent that year, and he was fiscally conservative, meaning he believes in conservatism in economics, but he was socially liberal, so he would believe in things like abortion rights and gay marriage and stuff like that. And that was sort of the best of both worlds for a lot of people, and it's not going to be enough to, get him any electoral votes, but it is enough to steal votes away from the Republicans. So Clinton will only actually get 43% of the popular vote, which is not even close to a majority, but he took home 370 electoral votes, which is all you need. So Clinton's domestic policy. This signals a generational change. He's the first Democrat in over 50 years to be elected to a second term. He's called the New Democrat. Now, one thing about Bill is that his presidency will constantly be surrounded by controversy, but we'll get to that later. So he had a very progressive agenda focusing on economic policy. He worked very closely with the Republican Congress. Both houses of the Congress were being controlled by Republicans throughout his entire presidency. They cut spending. They did increase taxes on the wealthy. He tried to pass a health care plan. He created a special task force headed by his wife Hillary Clinton to tackle high health care, but the plan was really awful. It was way too expensive and very complicated, so Congress never even voted on it. They just let it die. He does focus on crime a lot. He passes the Brady Bill, which instituted a mandatory waiting period in which gun vendors could check a buyer's criminal background before they could receive a gun. And he also passed into law the 94 Crime Bill, which banned 19 kinds of assault rifles, also created 100,000 law enforcement jobs, and did some other things like institute mandatory sentencing laws. But really the biggest piece of Clinton's domestic policy is something called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. This he is very much his brainchild. He worked very hard to get it passed. A strong opposition from labor unions, however, which was odd because they're usually supported by Democrats, and here we see them fighting. So what this does is it increases trading with Mexico and Canada. And the reason why this was so controversial then and is still controversial now is because it has led to a large amount of outsourcing of American jobs. A lot of businesses have fled to Mexico or Canada where they can produce or sell their goods. Where they could bake their product for a cheaper price because the laws are different there, but they can still send it to the United States for less money. So that has led to a lot of problems, which is why you see President Trump these days talking a lot about renegotiating the terms of NAFTA. So the Oklahoma City bombing was the deadliest act of terrorism in the United States until the 9/11 attacks. This happened on April 19th of 1995. At around 9:02 a.m., a truck bomb exploded and parked in front of a federal building in Oklahoma City. The entire north side of the building was blown apart, and 168 people were killed, including 19 children from the daycare center, which was located inside the building. The suspects initially, people were looking at Middle Eastern terrorist organizations because the United States had been the target of Middle Eastern terrorists for quite some time. So that wasn't something, it wasn't like random, idea. There was some logic behind that, but it ended up taking us in a different direction. The evidence did to these two guys you see here on the right, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. So Timothy McVeigh was he was a veteran from the Persian Gulf War, and he had somewhat claimed to be inspired by the Waco, Texas incident, and I encourage you to look that up if you don't know what it is. And then his right-hand man here is going to be Terry Nichols. So starting in September, remember this was in April, back in September, they had purchased large amounts of fertilizer and stored them in a rental shed in Kansas. Why fertilizer? So fertilizer has an ingredient called ammonium nitrate, and that was the main main ingredient for the homemade bomb. So they pretty much stole any other supplies that they needed. So the only paper trail was the fertilizer, and it's not illegal to buy fertilizer. So on April 17th, they rented a truck and loaded it with 5,000 pounds of this bomb. And then on the 19th, McVeigh drove it in front of the building, parked it, lit the fuse, left the keys, walked across the lot to an alley, and started to run because he knew it was about to blow up. So many people had reported seeing Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols with a third person during the planning stages of the attack. And then some people even said they saw a second person get out of the truck with Timothy McVeigh that morning. And we know it wasn't Terry Nichols because he was on surveillance cameras at a different location at that exact time. Now, as for their for the third person, there was no other evidence other than, eyewitnesses, and said FBI just sort of said it doesn't exist, and they moved on. Now, Terry Nichols, he's traveled actually to the Philippines 5 times and met with a guy named Ramzi Youssef, who's an international terrorist and was later convicted of masterminding the terrorist attack on the World Trade Centers back in 1993. If you didn't know, 2001 was not the first time the World Trade Centers were bombed. They were actually bombed back in 1993 as well. And a lot of people argued that both Nichols and McVeigh could not have made all this explosive by themselves, that maybe this guy had been a third person, that there had been another third person in the planning stages. But like I said, nevertheless, there was never any other real evidence, so both were convicted and executed. Last here we have the Columbine massacre. So this took place about 4 years exactly later. About 4 exact years later. This was on April 20th of 1999. So 2 students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, 18 and 17 years old, had planned this attack for over a year, hoping to kill hundreds of students at their high school, Columbine High School in Colorado. They came to school with firearms, explosives, 99 bombs actually, including 2 20-pound propane bombs. So the plan was to set off the 2 20-pound propane bombs in the cafeteria at lunch when the most amount of students would be there, about 500 students. So they wanted to kill about a fourth of the school in that explosive. And then after that, they would kill everyone else guns. Unfortunately for them, fortunately for the rest of us, the bombs did not go off the way that they planned, and they had to manage to evacuate the cafeteria anyway. So all 15 deaths were by gunshot wounds. They killed 12 students, 1 teacher, and themselves. The high school actually had surveillance cameras, including audio, around the entire school, so we did have evidence showing us exactly what happened the whole way. The most amount of bloodshed happened in the school library. There were over 50 people hiding in the library. So today the school has torn down the library and built a new one in memorial to all of the people who were killed. So this raises a lot of awareness about school security, about bullying. There's a lot of evidence that Eric and Dylan had both been bullied. Also gun access to kids and things like that. You got to think 1995 was a different age. Things like this didn't really happen. So this was and still is the deadliest high school shooting in American history. The only other school shooting deadlier than this was the Virginia Tech massacre.